11 with a Did You Know section. The end of the semester nears. So again, keep hanging in there, doing the good things that you're doing. As we wrap up Area 11 today, we have spent a lot of this week thinking about American revivalism, especially in the 1900s, and especially in the 1800s. But it's an interesting sort of thing to trace American revivalism. If we go back to the earliest revivals in the early and mid 1700s that were part of the First Great Awakening, it really did usher in a new type of evangelism, a new type of revivalism that Protestant churches really had not known previously. If you think about the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, largely for that century, they are battening down the hatches, they are making as much progress as they can, but it's really not through this sort of evangelism and revivalism. That just wasn't happening in Europe at the time. And when we get into the 1600s in Europe, there's a lot of religious warfare going on, there's a lot of back and forth. Folks are getting very theologically precise in terms of exactly what they believe and how that's different from what other people believe. And so it wasn't really the kind of gracious evangelistic work that we see happen a little bit later. By the time we get to the 1700s and what are the American colonies then at that point, lots of people who had come to the colonies, while there were some who were interested in religious freedom issues and they came for religious reasons, a lot of people did not come for religious reasons. So that when revival and evangelism begins to spread in the 1700s, there was a large audience for whom this was really something new spiritually, but even just a new type of event that had not been done before. Well, Jonathan Edwards sort of leads the way in the 1700s. His preaching was pretty localized in his own church and community. So that's going on during this time. But the First Great Awakening also ushers in sort of the first great itinerant preachers, those who traveled and spoke, like George Whitefield and John Wesley. Both of them are British, but both of them come to the Americas and do significant work here. Whitefield in particular brought an animated style of colloquial preaching to the masses, so much so that the small churches of America at the time could not contain the numbers of people who wanted to hear him. So Whitefield often moved outdoors, where he was noted for his ability to with his words and his voice, sort of spellbound, leave the audience spellbound as he presented the gospel. Not Edwards, but Wesley comes along and does much the same sort of thing, although not quite at the same level. And while both Whitefield and Edwards sort of come out of a Calvinist background, both are still calling for a response to the gospel. Both believe that that's important. So it's sort of a modified Calvinism. But they both sort of operated out of the position, Edwards and Whitefield, and even Wesley to some degree, that revivals could not be planned by humans. But to borrow one of Edwards' phrases, revivals were the result of the surprising work of God. The Spirit moved when and how it wanted. Humans reaped the benefits, but they could not control the stirrings of revival. So it really was in God's hands, and less about human activity and more about God's gracious moving to stir the hearts of God's people. Well, as the years went on and more revivalism moved away from the Calvinism of Whitefield and Edwards, So much so that when we get to the Second Great Awakening, that happens around the 1800s, when we get to folks that we read about for this week, like Finney and Moody, that shift has been very dramatic in terms of not only how revivals are done, but how we think about revivals as well. So that gone was the mysterious movement of the Spirit, as Edwards would talk about, and in its place came Finney's belief that revival was, and this is sort of his language, the right use of constituted means. In essence, if you planned revival correctly, then results could be expected. Planning meant having the right venue, having the right advertising. It meant churches working together to support the event. Lots went into these large multi-night events in the 1800s, but if planning was done correctly, then the community could expect God's Spirit to move. As a result, Finney and Moody both introduced new concepts, like the anxious bench. You read about a number of others that anticipated results in a way that Edwards and Whitefield had not. I guess the question that emerges for me is, can genuine revivals be planned, or is it simply the surprising work of God's Spirit? And I guess sort of connected with that, do those ideas have to be mutually exclusive? It certainly seemed that there is benefit to planning, coordinating dates, gaining community support, advertising, those sorts of things. But it seems risky, in my opinion, to assume that just because we do certain things and check certain boxes, that God's Spirit is required to move in people's lives as a result. That seems too formulaic, too mathematical. That scenario feels like we are in control and God must respond to our activities. As we'll see next week, some forms of revivalism, like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham, kept the model put forth by Finney and Moody. But we'll also see in the Pentecostal revival that great movements of the Spirit can still sometimes be surprising and unexpected.